Chinese communists now dominate, if not thoroughly control. And that would be the United Nations and most, if not actually all, of its subordinate agencies, including, importantly for this conversation, the World Health Organization, or WHO. The Chinese communists have relentlessly used these organizations to promote their agenda, which is global domination. Of late, they have been talking in the person of Xi Jinping, the dictator of Communist China, and others in the propaganda organs and influence operations of the CCP, about something that's being euphemistically described as global governance. By global governance, it's pretty clear the Chinese mean world domination with Chinese characteristics. The question is, in the myriad ways in which they are advancing that agenda, how important is what I think is best described as the global governance gambit, by which, as we will be discussing in the course of this program, international agencies, notably the UN and the WHO, are seeking and perhaps imminently obtaining authorities, powers, capabilities they've not had heretofore, and that can only be obtained and exercised at the expense of the sovereignty of member nations, most especially ours. We're going to be discussing what is afoot at the moment, as best we can discern it, what its implications are for both our national sovereignty and our personal sovereignty, and what we can do to assure that our constitutional republic is not sacrificed either by the CCP or its other assorted allies, proxies, and partners, or by the Biden administration at the expense of our constitutional republic and the freedoms that it guarantees. We're going to begin today's conversation with a woman who has served at senior levels of the United States government under the previous administration, that of Donald Trump. Her name is Pam Pryor. She has been, among other things, an individual with responsibilities in precisely this space as a senior bureau official for international organizational affairs and as an acting assistant secretary of state for this portfolio. She has been asked by us to address a very important topic she's well suited to attending, namely an eyewitness to the CCP's penetration and weaponization of international organizations. She's joining us by pre-recorded video. We're very appreciative of her doing so. And we'll go to the video with Pam Pryor now.
Thank you so much, and thank you for including me in this webinar. I'll tell you, you guys are just the go-to source for information, and I'm so pleased to be able to be here. My time at the State Department as the Acting Assistant Secretary for International Organizations had the WHO under my purview. And it's such an interesting time because we were in the throes of COVID-19. I remember that we first detected COVID-19 within the State Department when my team was in Geneva working on the World Intellectual Property Organization's race. And we were working to keep the Chinese out of there. Can you imagine having the Chinese in charge of intellectual property? As someone said, it's like Dracula in charge of the blood bank. So once Everyone was over there. We did win. We were successful in keeping them out of heading that organization. But we did find COVID-19 within the mission in Geneva. So our team came home. But I want to go back a little bit before that, and I'm actually going to even read you a bit of a story from Mike Pompeo, former Secretary Mike Pompeo's book on the WHO. And I think when it comes to China, we have to understand that in America, because of our Judeo-Christian roots, we actually believe in truth. We believe that there is a rule of law. We believe in morality. And so it's important to note that when we're dealing with China, we're dealing with a group that doesn't understand truth. They have no North Star. The Communist Party is just devoid and bankrupt of truth. So let me go back to a little bit of this. This is out of Mike Pompeo's book called Never Give an Inch. It says basically that we were very aware of the WHO's inability to act. In fact, under the Trump administration, Trump closed travel to China 2 weeks before the WHO moved in such a way. And of course, there was like, oh my gosh, you know, we were like throwing babies out of windows or something. You would think that we had just done the most heinous thing. And yet we did exactly what was right in the context of our own sovereignty. And that phrase is really important because when it comes to the UN and the WHO, sovereignty doesn't matter with them. They want to be in control, and ultimately this is about world domination and control. Controlling chaos is something that the Chinese say all the time, and under that rubric goes all kinds of bad things. For example, you control chaos for an offshoot of the Muslim faith called Uyghurs. So you put them all in a concentration camp and you harvest their organs, but that's controlling chaos. So again, remember, you have to kind of go back in time a little bit. We knew in 2019, we started hearing about these things. In fact, in late 2019, we actually called over to Beijing and said, we hear there's this flu-like virus going along around. Can we help you? Can we help? No, 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 nothing to see here, folks. Just move along. There's nothing happening, which again is the fact that they always demur. They always cover up. And some people say it's that old Asian face-saving thing, but it's not. It's out of their reality is in their heads. They don't look at facts. So we are dealing with a dangerous, dangerous group. But anyway, let me go to a bit of an excerpt out of former Secretary Mike Pompeo's book, Never Give an Inch. It's about holding the WHO accountable for failure. With the party working overtime to obliterate the truth of the origins of COVID-19, Pompeo says he made it his personal mission to learn as much as possible. The WHO should have been on top of this, but failed miserably. Its track record early in the days of the pandemic revealed that it had no real intention of holding China accountable. It refused to publish Taiwan's warnings on December 31 that the virus was spreading via human-to-human transmission. It even praised China for its handling of the virus on January 19th, when the CCP likely knew it had a raging pandemic on its hands. Even on January 30th, and this is, now we're in 2020, when it was clear that the virus was spreading by human-to-human transmission, the WHO expressed confidence in, quote, China's capacity to control the outbreak, end quote. Clearly, even the world's so-called public health experts had learned nothing from China's cover-ups during the earlier SARS episode. The WHO's lackadaisical, non-confrontational posture revealed that it was more concerned with appeasing its Chinese masters than pushing for answers and access. And this was all brought about by the WHO's director, Dr. Tedros, who is still the WHO's director. He had achieved his position with Chinese support and was always fearful of offending his communist patron. And there was probably some classified information, but there is some thought that Tedros had basically sold his soul to the CCP in order to get this position, more than just the normal horse trading in international elections. So I can't understate how important it is for us to be very wary of two things. You know, it's that old joke about how do you tell when someone's lips are moving or someone's lying, it's that their lips are moving. Well, I think that's true of China. Here's how you tell if they're lying. If they're talking, they're probably lying. And again, we were always so careful at the State Department to make a complete differentiation between the Chinese people, who we have a great deal of affection for, and their horrible form of government, the Chinese Communist Party. But the Communist Party lies for a living. They don't even know the difference between truth and lies. And it's also interesting to note that while the CCP did let the WHO investigate the outbreak in February of 2020, it was pointless. And then by the time they really did let people come in 21, they had a 1-for-1 match of Chinese to internationals there to investigate. And by then, all of the evidence had been destroyed at the Wuhan lab. I want to also just remind you of one other historical fact that we need to be very careful about going forward. And that's that we originally thought at the State Department that it was a lab leak that created this horrible thing that destroyed so many lives and economies and set children back years in their education. We said early on that it was a lab leak. The CCP and the WHO absolutely denied this constantly. So again, we just have to be very careful when dealing with the WHO to understand that they are not in it for the good of America. They're in it to reproduce themselves, which is so typical of UN international organizations. And also there is a lack of sovereignty. I'm not in the business, and I don't get any profits from hawking Mike Pompeo's book, but I would say to Frank Gaffney, we cannot wait to read his book. But again, I think just the lesson for all of us is to understand that truth is lacking from the CCP. And we have to remember that our sovereignty and our place in the world is more important than kowtowing to an organization that just can't understand the truth. And one other thing to note, the Chinese Communist Party is getting more and more brazen, whether it's the outright funding of American academic institutions, and then also being right over our border, coming in through our southern border, but also buying off our friends and partners, our allies in the Western Hemisphere. So we need to be very careful of this and be aware that the posture with the WHO, with the CCP, should always be one of wariness and leading with the fact that we need to take care of Americans first. So let me turn it back to you all, and thank you so much for including me today.
Thank you, Secretary Pryor. As always, your insights are invaluable and certainly set the stage for the next series of presentations about the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and this whole global governance gambit. I'm so grateful to you. I'm especially grateful to you for giving me an opportunity to plug the new book, which I now have in my hands. It is entitled The Indictment: Prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and Friends for Crimes Against America, China, and the World. And I'm very proud that my co-author is Didi Logison, our executive secretary at the Committee on the Present Danger of China. We look forward to discussing this book and its contents in greater detail on another occasion, but I just want to say to those of you who are subscribers to this webinar series or tuning into this one and may yet become acquainted with the rest of this incredible body of work, over 75 different webinars like this one in the space of just the past 9 or so months. We've tried to make them as accessible as possible by really distilling the essence of what we have found about the unrestricted warfare of the CCP, becoming, as Pam Pryor has just said, increasingly brazen, but also the extent to which we are beset by Americans who are aiding and abetting the Chinese Communist Party in waging that war against us. We have 9 charges in this indictment: crimes against humanity, war crimes against our country, and 20 recommended action steps. And as I say, we'll talk more about that. I hope you'll check it out. It's available for pre-order now. It will be released on the 9th of May. Also, while you're at it, check out Mike Pompeo's new book as well. Reggie Littlejohn, our friend and colleague, distinguished member of the Committee on the Present Danger China, the co-chair with me of the Stop Vax Passports Task Force, and in addition to all of that, the founder and president of a wonderful organization, Women's Rights Without Frontiers. We have been very, very blessed by having Reggie's contributions to so many of these programs and our leadership and everything that we do. And we're delighted that she's here to talk to us a bit about this phenomenon of the CCP's capture of these international organizations and weaponization of them, yes, but also a bit about the degree to which this affront and, well, crushing of our sovereignty is something that must be resisted at every turn. She's in the forefront of what we call our Sovereignty Coalition, and we're delighted to have her here to talk a bit about it, as well as the problem that it addresses, the globalization, if you will, the global governance, the digital gulag, and more. So, Reggie Littlejohn, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Frank. So in 2019, China announced a people's war against the United States. Now, this people's war is not a kinetic war, doesn't involve tanks, but it involves all kinds of other things like the economy, economic warfare, political warfare, ideological warfare, digital warfare, information warfare, and global governance warfare. And just as recently as March 13th of 2023, Xi Jinping said that China should, quote, actively participate in the reform and construction of the global governance system. So China is actively promoting a global governance system, and what that system is basically is, global governments under the Chinese Communist Party. So how are they doing this? One of the main ways that they're doing this is by exercising outsized influence in various globalist organizations. So they have more influence probably than any other country at the United Nations, at the World Economic Forum, certainly at the WHO, which we saw just basically parroting whatever lies China was saying, such as that there's no human-human transmission, etc. So I've been asked to talk about the fight for our sovereignty, and that fight is centered right now in the Sovereignty Coalition, which Frank Gaffney and I are kind of co-leading or co-convening. And the bottom line of that is that the U.S. needs to withdraw from the World Health Organization. So again, the Biden administration is pushing the amendments to the international health regulations and the pandemic treaty, and the Chinese Communist Party is exercising its influence such that if these are passed, the World Health Organization will go from being non-binding to being a regulatory agency. They will be able to declare pandemics and potential pandemics for humans, plants, animals, and the environment without the consent of a country, including the United States. It sets up a biotech surveillance state where every nation is required to surveil its citizens for misinformation and disinformation, and also to issue health IDs that are interoperable and international, so that this gives rise to the vaccine passport, China social credit system planet, excuse me, China social credit system, which gives rise to complete total surveillance and absolute control. And if you combine that with a central bank digital currency, then if you don't comply, if, for example, the World Health Organization mandates vaccines and you refuse to have one, they could just shut you off from your credit card, your bank account, and if we live in a cashless society, you will have no access to money at all. So just imagine how catastrophic that would be. So we at the Sovereignty Coalition have a declaration that the United States should withdraw from the World Health Organization. That's the only way to get out of this, because we can't stop it from passing. The World Health Organization, we're only one of 194 countries, and the World Health Organization just basically votes on increasing its own powers. So that is an action that I would like everybody to take, is to go to sovereigntycoalition.org and sign that declaration. And when you do that, it will go to your senators and your congressional representative to alert them to this issue. Most of them don't know about that. But the World Health Organization, there's only one way that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to take over this global governance system, the other being the United Nations. And this new document was just issued March 2023. It's called Our Common Agenda, Strengthening the International Response to Complex Global Shocks, an Emergency Platform. So it's a pretty heavy document, but I just want to read what their ultimate goal is. All right, the ultimate goal here is, I propose, I think this is General Secretary of the United Nations, I propose that the General Assembly of the United Nations provide the Secretary General and the United Nations system with a standing authority to convene and operationalize automatically an emergency platform in the event of a future complex global shock of sufficient scale, severity, and reach. Now, I don't have time to completely unpack this, but this is going to be operationalized automatically. And so how are they going to do that? Number one, what does that mean? If this platform to respond to any kind of global shock, which would include a pandemic or climate change or any number of other things, that again, that is an abrogation of our national sovereignty. If this thing is going to operationalize automatically, that means that the United States and other countries around the world are not going to have any say in it, and they're not going to be able to stop it. So this again is something that is unconstitutional, and it's against our sovereignty. And how are they going to find out if there is some kind of a potential problem? They're going to do it through surveillance. So this document is just like it's an initial vision. It hasn't gotten down to how they're going to do it, but I have no doubt that they're going to do it in the same way that the World Health Organization is trying to get their global powers, which is by founding a biotech surveillance state with the powers of censorship. And then when you combine that again with this central bank digital currency, which the Biden administration is currently in the process of development or rolling out, it's a way of trapping us all in a digital gulag. So I would just urge everyone to take the first step in countering this by going over to sovereigntycoalition.org and signing the declaration. Once this trap snaps shut, once we're in a surveillance state with censorship and our credit cards and bank accounts can be shut off, then there will be no more dissent, because as soon as we try to dissent, we'll just be paralyzed. All right, so we've got to register our dissent now. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. That's always a splendid summation of the challenge before us and some practical ideas as to what do we do about them. I want to turn next to Jonathan Emord, a constitutional attorney who previously served as part of the staff of the Federal Communications Commission. He is the author of a very important book, The Authoritarians, Their Assault on Individual Liberty, the Constitution and free enterprise from the 19th century to the present. He is, as it happens, in addition, a candidate for the United States Senate from the Commonwealth of Virginia. We've asked him to join us to talk about this phenomenon of global governance and the threat that it does represent to our constitutional republic. Jonathan Emord, we're delighted to have you back. Welcome. The floor is yours, sir.
Great to be with you. Well, obviously, I think most people would understand that the Constitution of the United States creates a sovereign nation, which our powers are limited in government, and they're specifically defined. And so when we have a situation where the CCP is using international organizations to acquire greater control over our own domestic policy through agreements with the Biden administration, we have the very undoing of the Constitution by sort of a evisceration or an exsanguination of the life's blood of the Constitution through an external entity. It shouldn't come as a surprise to us that this is part of the Biden administration, because the open borders policy is in fact the same thing, isn't it? It's allowing individuals who have foreign domiciles and residencies and nationalism to come into the United States without need to renounce their citizenship in a foreign country, without need to explain for a moment their loyalty to the United States or to swear to it, and with no vetting at all. So in other words, as we've seen with a large number of new Chinese nationals coming through illegally through the southern border, there's a huge temptation for foreign powers to abuse that, not least of which is China. So if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to take the lives, liberties, and property of your own people and put it in peril as a result of allowing drug cartels, in complicity with the communist Chinese, by the way, drug cartels to pour into this country all manner of malfeasance and miscreants to achieve terrorist ends, then why wouldn't you sell out the entire Constitution? The Constitution, in fact, requires that the United States guarantee a republican form of government of the states and also guard the states against invasion. And it also allows the states effective war powers in instances where the states are invaded to arrest, detain, and expel those that come in. And yet these things are not activated, are they? They're not being put into place. They're not being followed. And so overall, what we see then is a movement by the United States to be complicit in a globalization effort whereby sovereignty and protection for the rights that are protected by the Constitution and that are unalienable rights given to us by God are made vulnerable to foreign actors who can exercise control within the United States without impediment from the Biden administration. And so we also see a complete failure of domestic law enforcement against this. We see individuals who are with the CCP, over 93,000 individuals here granted authority to have visas in this country and appear here and stay here by the CCP, are functioning effectively for the Ministry of State Secrets to engage in espionage. And then we have electronic espionage taking place, and we have infiltration of all of the major institutions. We have government and schools and local governments, all working in tandem with a universe of what Azra Nomani has referred to as the woke army. That is, people who want to destroy the United States and want to achieve a ruination of our values and our history and our culture in order to create a dictatorship here in the United States. So in order to prevent that, we have to take extraordinary measures, but we aren't. So we're leaving ourselves completely vulnerable to a complete takedown of our republic. And that's really in the offing right now.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. couldn't have said it better myself. A complete takedown of our constitutional republic is in the offing. And
Sure.
we want to know that this is not something we're making up. It is something that is now increasingly being documented. And we're very pleased to have with us one of the men who has been documenting it impressively at the Epoch Times. He had a front page article on the subject entitled UN Seeks Vast New Powers for Global Emergencies in, I believe, last week's print edition. His name is Alex Newman. He is a contributor to, of course, the Epoch Times and other publications as well. An international award-winning journalist, as well as an educator, author, and consultant who co-authored a book entitled Crimes of the Educators: How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. Alex, I wanted to thank you for this really important article that pulled together a number of, well, dots, as they say, in a manner that helps us understand that the kinds of things that Reggie talked about and the kinds of things that I know we're all seized with here, whether it's in the Chinese Communist Party's playbook or whether it's in the World Health Organization negotiations or whether it's, as you've described, in the United Nations plans, this is a mortal threat to our constitutional republic, and we're anxious to hear more about what your research and analysis has told you about what's coming perhaps as soon as September in the UN General Assembly with respect to global governance, the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, among others. Welcome, sir, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the kind words and the kind introduction. Yeah, this is a story I've been following my entire career as a journalist. It is hard to overstate the significance of this. And there's really two threads that kind of come together here perfectly in this story. One of them is the ongoing expansion of the mass murdering Communist Chinese Party's influence around the world. They're in the process of imploding what they referred to as the unipolar world order, with a kind of an unchallengeable United States government as the global hegemonic power, and moving very rapidly toward what they describe as a multipolar world order, with the maybe the chief of those poles being Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, which I know has been talked about, but just for emphasis, this is the most murderous entity that has ever existed in human history. There's no other entity in all of recorded human history that we know of that has killed as many people as this party. And so I've been documenting what they've been doing for well over 15 years now. Even when I was in college, I was working on this. The other critical story is the ongoing expansion of the influence, the power of the United Nations, and the Communist Chinese penetration of the United Nations. This has been going on for a very long time. Unfortunately, it's been going on outside of the spotlight. I have known about this, and I've been trying to sound the alarm about this, but very few people in the media or even in the government, frankly, when I talk to members of Congress, a lot of them are totally clueless about what's happening here. We have now card-carrying members of the Communist Party of China. I mean, there's no secret about it. They used to hold very high-level posts in the regime before moving over to the UN. The Communist Party has said frequently that even once they're serving within the United Nations, their top loyalty needs to be to the Communist Party, not to the international community or some nebulous notion of humanity. And so we now have all of these UN institutions at the highest levels penetrated by card-carrying members of the Communist Party and even by their minions. When I refer to their minions, I think the perfect example of this is the individual who's running the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who prior to becoming the head of the World Health Organization served on the Politburo of the ethno-Marxist terrorist organization, the Tigray People's Liberation Front in Ethiopia. Of course, he was installed with help from the Communist Party of China. I had multiple sources within the UN tell me that they were using bribery and blackmail to get other governments to support his candidacy. And now in retrospect, looking back at the last 3 years, it should be very obvious why they put such an emphasis on having one of their operatives, one of their agents, running this critical organization. So for some perspective here, just to give folks a sense of how bad this is, if you look at the UN has 15 specialized agencies, very similar to what you would expect from, say, a national government, from what people would expect are the attributes of a state. things like a police force, things like military forces with the ability to enforce its wishes, things like courts, right? The UN has the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Of course, the U.S. hasn't ratified that yet, but you've got an environmental agency, you've got a health agency, you've got an education agency. So all these attributes that we typically associate with a nation state are now possessed by this international organization called the UN. Well, of these 15 specialized agencies, at the last time that I checked, and I wrote a big article about this last year for the Epoch Times, 5 of the 15 were actually led by a card-carrying member of the Communist Chinese Party. That doesn't even include the non-Chinese operatives who are subservient to the Communist Party of China, people like Tedros Ghebreyesus. So at the highest levels, you have members of the CCP operating these UN agencies. And when they're not actually running the agency itself, they're serving as Deputy Director General or Assistant Director General of key agencies, including the UN Education Agency, the UN Environmental Agency, even agencies where there's very significant and sensitive secrets, things like the World Intellectual Property Organization, which Communist Chinese agents are using to loot Western technology. So for perspective, if you've got 15 agencies, 5 in the hands of an actual member of the Communist Party of China, for perspective, the last time I looked, there was 1 American running one of these organizations, the World Food Program. That was Beasley, former governor of South Carolina, and I believe he's now out. So when you put that in perspective, the Communist Chinese have far more influence within the United Nations system than the U.S. government does. You have people within the U.S. State Department at the highest levels, and this was true even during the Obama administration, openly supporting this process. Right? At the highest levels of the State Department, you have senior Biden people and even senior Obama people from the previous administration openly celebrating in public comments this ongoing Communist Chinese takeover of UN agencies, saying that this is a good thing, that we're bringing China into the world order. Frankly, I don't understand how somebody could think having a mass murdering regime exercising influence over powerful institutions like this is a good idea. You combine that then with the espionage. You combine that then with the war that they are waging on Americans. And I know you've done almost more than anybody on this subject, Frank, exposing the ongoing war that the Communist Party of China is waging against America, not yet with bullets and missiles, although that may come sooner than any of us would like. But in speaking to sources at the highest levels of the federal government, I actually tried to get Kevin Moley on here today. He was one of my sources from my most recent article. He was Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations during the Trump administration. He had previously served as U.S. ambassador to international organizations in Geneva. So he's got a lot of experience here. He called this the most important existential threat to our country, maybe going back all the way to the founding of our republic. And, you know, that's not to minimize the dangers of the Civil War or the different things that have afflicted our country, but that's to emphasize how serious this threat is, where you have a superpower that has an economy that is almost as large as, if not as large as, or even larger than our economy, that has a military that is almost as powerful, if not more powerful in some ways, from having stolen all of our technology and from having all these personnel. To have them in control of the machinery of what they call global governance, when people like Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who used to be the leader of the Socialist International, are calling for even more power for the UN. Now, the article I did in the Epoch Times on the front page last week is about this plan they have to have the UN basically become the emergency, the first responder to global emergencies. And they say very clearly in this document that they should own and control the response from national governments and from businesses, from the private sector, from civil society, from the experts. They're talking about really total control over the response to global emergencies. We got kind of a sneak preview of that with COVID. So take that, and as Kevin Moley put it, this would be the equivalent to putting the Communist Party of China in charge of global emergencies. You almost can't imagine anything worse, right? It's just that crazy, and yet it's happening. The media is not talking about it. The danger here, not just to Americans, by the way, the threat to Americans is existential. It is unbelievably significant. I think it's almost impossible to overstate the danger here, but it's not just to us. It's to freedom around the world. It's to our allies. It's even to nations that aren't necessarily allied with us, that enjoy some measure of protection from the kind of world order that has existed over the last few generations. So we're talking everything is on the line here. All of this is proceeding in the open, even though they're not talking about it in the press. And if Americans don't wake up, I can guarantee you this process will march onwards and probably accelerate.
Thank you very much, Alex. A chilling words, but born of, as you say, extensive study and research of how this has developed over time. Let me just ask you, if I may, one specific question on sort of the mechanics of what you've just described. We understand that in the World Health Organization, the agreements that are now being negotiated with the active help of the Biden administration need simply be approved by votes of the World Health Assembly. In the case of these amendments to the International Health Regulation by a majority vote, in the case of what's being called, at least internally, a pandemic treaty, by a 2/3 majority vote of the World Health Assembly. We have no veto there. Even if the administration were opposed to it, it would be approved. How would a similar kind of authority for international crises, as they're being called, as opposed to these public health emergencies of international concern, be granted to the United Nations?
Yeah, great question, Frank. And if you read this report that the UN put out, that the UN Secretary General put out, it's called Our Common Agenda. They actually make this very clear. The Secretary General would essentially determine what constitutes a global emergency. And if you read the report, they actually say it doesn't really have to be global, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be an emergency. If the Secretary General determines that these protocols need to be activated, he would summon the national governments of the world. He would summon the private sector interests and bring them all together. And in very plain English, they actually say in this report that the UN and the multilateral agencies, that would be, the UN Education Agency, the UN Environmental Agency, would then be the primary, is the term that's used, decision makers in this. So it's all very nebulous. It's all very arbitrary. There is no kind of like fixed law. It's really up to the decision of the Secretary General when it would be convened, what would happen in response to these global emergencies. They don't even tell you precisely what kind of emergency it might be. They say it might be climate change. It might be environmental degradation. It might be an economic crisis. It might be a pandemic. It might be something from outer space. I mean, it's really just a door that's open wide enough to drive a Mack truck through. And once these protocols are activated, there's no mention in this entire policy document of any restraints on the power of the Secretary General or the various UN agencies, again, many of which are under the direct control of an active member of the Communist Party of China.
Wow. So you say protocols. Are those protocols under negotiation, or is he simply pulling them out of his hat and establishing that at any point he can begin this kind of convening authority, which then translates into directive authority?
Yeah, well, they're trying to seek specific approval from the member states of the United Nations at an upcoming summit. This will be held in September in New York amid the General Assembly meeting there that happens every year. They're calling it a Summit of the Future. And it's one of several policy proposals that are being advanced under this Our Common Agenda banner, if you will. So at the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, their theme, I believe, was Stronger UN, Better World, or something like that. And the theme was, we really need to strengthen and empower the UN to do so much more, right? The world is complex, the world is interconnected, and they use the slogan over and over again. These are problems that are global, and so we need global solutions. And so if they get their way, if the Secretary General gets his way, and there's going to be zero resistance from the Biden administration, as they made clear when I reached out to the State Department for this article, the mechanisms then would be put in place to activate these protocols that are being, right now they've got kind of a rough outline. I imagine they'll have something a little more concrete to present in September when the time comes. Then they want to set up a futures lab where they'll be in charge of kind of looking at the future. What might it look like? What should we be doing? They want to appoint a special representative for future generations. And so under the guise of helping future generations, they want to direct national and global policy toward what they call sustainable development and Agenda 2030. And Agenda 2030, they make clear throughout this document, is a critical guiding instrument to this. So when you try to think of what the protocols will look like, over and over and over again, they reference UN Agenda 2030. It's also known as the Sustainable Development Goals. When they were approving this back in 2015, again, with the full support of the Obama administration and with a very hearty endorsement from the Communist Chinese Party, they called this the Master Plan for Humanity. And so now to implement this master plan for humanity, if there is some sort of global or even regional emergency, this would supposedly require the UN to step in. And as examples of the types of contributions that would then be under the leadership of the UN in the event of some emergency declared by the Secretary General, they talk about giving money. Right? How much money could they forcibly extract from us? It's not made clear, but theoretically, under the policy document, indefinite amounts. They say this could even require changes in policy. They might order our national governments to change particular policies. Now, as you pointed out earlier, and as I think most true Americans know, none of this is constitutional. The federal government itself doesn't have these powers, much less the power to give them away to an international unelected organization. But this is what they want to do. This is what they've put down on paper that we can see. And now the real question will be, are they going to get this approved in September? It very much looks like they will. And then what will the details look like once that formal proposal is made coming in a few months?
So, and I'm taking advantage of your expertise in this matter, but very quickly, the process, as you understand it, would not be subject to a veto by the United States government, even if it were disposed to cast a veto. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, they're hoping to do this at the General Assembly, and this has been a subtle shift that they've been working on for as far back as I can remember. I really started focusing on this as I got out of college. They've been trying to market the UN General Assembly, as former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon put it, as the Parliament of Humanity. So they want us to look at the General Assembly as if it were a parliament, as if it were a true legislative body allegedly representing the interests of the people. Now, we all know that, Kim Jong-un does not legitimately represent the people of North Korea. We know that the Communist Party of China does not legitimately represent the people of China. But the marketing that they're trying to do here is that if this Parliament of Humanity agrees that these protocols should be adopted, for example, then that is settled global international law. And so, of course, we know that that is not compatible with our Constitution, but that's the kind of narrative that they want to set, that if this is approved by the member states, it shall be binding on all of us.
Reggie, you've heard what's just been described here, and of course we've been talking at length of late about the World Health Organization going through a similar kind of operation, as we discussed. Talk a little bit about the failure of the United States Senate to stand up recently, when asked to do so, for its constitutional duties and responsibilities and authorities to safeguard us from this kind of international agreement, treaty, entanglement, whatever you want to call it.
So first thing I want to say is it's an honor to serve on this panel with Alex Newman, who's a huge thought leader in this space. And I read your articles, very authoritative, very deep analysis. So thank you for your decades of research on this. In answer to your question, Frank, people think that the Constitution kind of operates on its own, and they'll say things like, oh, well, what you're saying is really bad about the WHO, but it'll never happen, it's unconstitutional, or, well, it'll never pass the Senate. These things do not operate on their own, okay? We are under the heavy influence of the Chinese Communist Party and various globalist organizations, and as Alex said, our federal government doesn't have these powers to give away. So this whole thing is unconstitutional. Is that going to save us? Absolutely not. Because the Biden administration is actually behind rushing this out. They are trying to promote this. And so Senator Johnson, like maybe about 3 weeks ago at this point, he actually proposed an amendment, which said any agreement by the World Health Organization can only be enforced with the advice and consent of the Senate. All right? Sounds constitutional to me, right? Well, the Senate itself voted it down. And that vote went straight down party lines. And Senator Johnson sent out a tweet saying, it's so sad to see that the Democrats don't care about our national sovereignty. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, that there has been a sneak attack, like an ambush, in the National Defense Authorization Act. So the NDAA passed on December 23rd of 2022, the very last minute of the previous Congress. It was 1,722 pages long, and on page, and I think they got maybe 24 hours to read it. No one read that 1,722 pages right before Christmas, right? So on page 950 of that act, there was something called the International Pandemic Preparedness Act of 2022. And in that act, within an act, there was language in there that said that the United States must adhere to and comply with, and then it lists various international instruments. The first one was the International Health Regulations of the World Health Organization of 2005, and then it named like 5 other known international instruments. And then the last, number 6, was and any other framework relevant to international health security. I mean, how vague can you get? So that would clearly obligate the United States to comply with and adhere to future agreements that from the World Health Organization, ones that hadn't even been written yet. So then it can be argued that when these pass the World Health Organization, that they've already been passed by our Congress or the Senate, because the Senate voted on the NDAA. So people cannot sit back and just assume, oh, well, this is unconstitutional, it'll never pass the Senate, so I don't have to worry about it. You have to worry about it now, because once these things get voted in, and as I said before, if they are combined, if this biotech surveillance state is combined with a central bank digital currency, then if after it happens, we decide we don't like it and we say something, we will be cut off from our credit cards and our bank accounts and completely silenced. The time to take action is now.
Reggie, thank you. We'll talk in a moment a little bit more about what that action might look like. But Alex, back to you quickly. The Summit of the Future and this Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals and so many others of these nostrums and plans and agendas, I think are completely unknown to Americans, with the possible exception of a handful of people in jobs like Kevin Moley's and Pam Pryor's in the past. But is it in fact the case that under the color of these kinds of arrangements that you're talking about, set aside the whole issue of crises that they might dictate, they deem we have, and then dictate what we need to do about them, but that we are going to find ourselves actually formally bound by those multilateral plans, agendas, and arrangements as well?
Yeah, that is absolutely their intention, Frank. And thank you, Reggie, for those kind words. The feeling's definitely mutual. You really educated me on what was happening with Planned Parenthood and the Communist Party of China with the UN and the forced population control. I'm so thankful for your work. But what the UN is doing is that they're trying to create this narrative that this is inevitable and that everybody is bound by these agreements that they're coming up with. And the Paris Agreement is a very good example of this, and the Agenda 2030 is a good example of how they're doing this with the full cooperation of top officials in our federal government, especially from the executive branch. So I was actually in Paris at the UN Climate Summit where they negotiated this Paris Agreement. I almost couldn't believe what was happening. You had Barack Obama show up and say, we're going to slash American emissions of carbon dioxide by 30-something% within the next 10 or 15 years. And of course, he wasn't planning on presenting this to the U.S. Senate for ratification. Not that that would be constitutional even if the Senate were to ratify it. But he's making these grandiose pledges. And then he's saying, this is not a treaty. This is an executive agreement. We are going to implement it through executive orders, through policy memoranda, through regulations coming out of our regulatory agencies. And that's exactly what they did. Now, some of this was restrained a little bit by the federal court system, but I would say the federal courts made a dent in the problem. They didn't even come close to fully addressing it. We saw the same thing with Agenda 2030. This was, again, the head of the UN General Assembly called this the master plan for humanity. This requires the reorientation of all of our industries, of all of our lives, a total redefinition of government, of the social contract, This is absolutely huge. I mean, this involves every element of every single one of our lives. And yet they were saying this is not a treaty. This is an executive agreement. And so in China, the rubber stamp legislature actually had to ratify this, to give you a sense of it. And as soon as this was approved by all the governments of the world, the Communist Party of China celebrated. They used all their propaganda organs, their newspapers, their international wires, Xinhua, et cetera, to say that they played a crucial role in coming up with Agenda 2030. Again, a policy to totally restructure the planet. The World Economic Forum then brought the businesses on board. They signed on as a strategic partner in 2019 to get this implemented through the business sector. And so obviously this is not constitutional. Obviously the U.S. Senate is not going to ratify these things. Obviously they are not the true definition of international law. And yet, despite us knowing all of that, these things are still being implemented at every level by the federal government, by many of our democratic state governments, and unfortunately, even many Republican states have been brought on board through mechanisms like federal funding. So they'll send, just as an example, the Federal Department of Transportation will send a grant to a state, or will give them money to build a highway or something, and then buried in the small text will say, but you also have to comply with XYZ mandates. And so then these things are being implemented even in conservative counties, in conservative states. And so technically it's not binding international law. These aren't binding international treaties, which is what they always say in their defense. And yet they're being implemented. They are impacting our lives. They are restructuring our economies. And so they have the force of international law, even though they aren't technically.
That's extremely helpful. Reggie, back to you. The plan that is now afoot in the World Health Organization, as you mentioned earlier, does not require the assent of the United States government. Evidently, it's not going to receive the consideration by the Senate. It may already be considered pre-approved by statute. This has given rise in our sovereignty coalition to what seems to be the only possible relief from what might happen otherwise to our sovereignty, to our constitutional republic. Talk a little bit about that, and does it need to be applied to the United Nations as well?
Speaking on my own behalf, not the Sovereignty Coalition, I believe that we need to withdraw from the World Health Organization and from the United Nations. I mean, what are they giving us? We get no benefits from this at all. We're hugely underwriting them. And now what they want to do is the same thing as what the World Health Organization wants to do on steroids. Okay, the World Health Organization wants to be able to come in and run our healthcare without our consent, including what is the response to any kind of a health issue. So they will be able to mandate in the United States. They will tell us we have to have mask mandates, we have to have vaccine mandates, meaning everyone needs to be vaccinated, meaning forced vaccinations, forced quarantines, etc. And the United Nations wants to be able to do that not just on health issues, but on any issues. I'm looking at page 6 of this document, strengthening the international response to complex global shocks. So, World Health Organization wants health. United Nations wants everything. They want major climatic events. So they want climate change. They want pandemics. Of course, that they can do that through the World Health Organization. Biological warfare, disruption of global flows of goods or people. So if there's a travel disruption, or if there's some kind of a supply chain disruption, cyberspace and global digital connectivity disruption. So if there's a problem with the internet, major event in outer space, they don't define that. So I don't know whether that's an asteroid or whether that's some kind of a satellite issue, or listen to this, unforeseen black swan event. Okay, so in case that doesn't cover everything, the unforeseen black swan event does. And so what they're saying is that the Director General will be able to decide that he would have standing authority to convene and operationalize automatically an emergency platform in the event of a future complex global shock of sufficient scale, severity, and reach. So that's our sovereignty right out the window. He gets to decide, somebody from outside the United States, the Director General of the United Nations gets to decide if this emergency platform is going to be implemented in the United States and worldwide. These are unelected bureaucrats. And so what do we get out of this? Do we think that the Director General of the United Nations can tell us how to respond to any one of these issues better than we can decide on our own? I just think that they're completely worthless in terms of helping to the United States and to the world, frankly. And I think that we should withdraw from the United Nations. That's my personal opinion.
Thank you, Reggie. Alex, let me ask you, having, again, studied these matters closely, do you see any alternative to withdrawing from, well, one or both of these organizations, if we are to try to preserve sovereignty that would otherwise be crushed by these kinds of new powers that they're assuming?
Yeah, there are really two schools of thought here. One of those schools of thought is that we should get more involved in the United Nations to try to steer it in our direction. The other school of thought is that we need to defund and even get out of the United Nations. There has been legislation introduced almost every Congress for several decades now. Congressman Larry McDonald used to introduce it. Congressman Ron Paul used to introduce it. Most recently, I believe the chief co-sponsor was Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky. And I had an opportunity to interview him about this bill. But it would basically get us out of the United Nations, get us out of the World Health Organization, get our troops out from under UN command so they couldn't be summoned even by the UN Security Council to go enforce so-called peace and security. And, you know, my personal opinion, speaking just as an individual, not as a journalist or anything, I think that's the best route to go. You know, if you look back at the history of the United Nations, what you'll find is that these subversive influences, these globalist aspirations, and even this strand of communism, that's been there from the very beginning. I mean, if you look at, for example, after World War II, the major parties that came together to build the UN, you had the Soviet Union, one of the most murderous entities that had ever existed up until that time. Then you had the U.S. government, which, you know, the U.S. government was pretty decent at that time. Well, we sent an individual by the name of Alger Hiss as one of our lead guys. And he's almost been wiped out of the history books today, although his role was so significant. They made him the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter, which, I mean, that should have been a big red flag. Then they made him the first Secretary General of the United Nations. Yeah, that should have been a big red flag. Then we put him in prison. He was prosecuted because he was a spy. He was an agent of Joseph Stalin. So when you have those kinds of influences at the very beginning of this organization, you know, it is my view, my personal opinion, that this is a dangerous organization. I don't believe U.S. taxpayers are well served by spending a lot of money on this. I don't believe our Constitution is compatible with the kind of vision that they have and that their member states have, frankly. And I believe we can have perfectly adequate international relations by dealing on a one-on-one basis with foreign governments. I mean, this was kind of a cornerstone of Donald Trump's foreign policy. We're going to have bilateral relations with other governments. We've got an embassy in your capital. You have an embassy in Washington, D.C. We can deal with each other on that basis. We don't have to go through Antonio Guterres. We don't have to go through the Russians and the Chinese to be able to talk to other governments. It's simply not necessary. And when you look at the aspirations that they have now publicly revealed for all to see, I mean, if we're honest, they're talking here about a global system that it would eliminate individual freedom, that would eliminate self-government, that would eliminate even the last vestiges of national sovereignty. I don't think that's compatible with our traditions in America. I don't think that's compatible with our Constitution. And I don't think that's desirable in any way, shape, or form. We've seen the dangers of concentrated power throughout human history. As far as I'm concerned, it's a recipe for disaster. And this American Sovereignty Restoration Act, which I don't know that it's been introduced in this Congress yet, but Andy Biggs has been previously a co-sponsor. A lot of the best members of Congress have co-sponsored this in the past. We've had Senator Rand Paul speaking openly about this. So I think there is a political solution to this particular problem, and that is, as Reggie suggested, getting out. And without us, honestly, the UN would collapse without American funding and without American participation. So.
And the legitimacy that
right.
we accord to these things. I think we have to wrap it at that. Such incredibly powerful statements, and I'm just struck as we're talking that when you look at all the things that we're asked to focus on, the topic du jour of a exercise going on in this Tennessee state legislature, for example, enormous focus of attention in the media and elsewhere, or you know, the climate change debates, or even stuff that matters more, I think, than either of those for sure, like, you know, the insecurity of our southern border. But we're literally ignoring entirely these trains that are hurtling down the tracks. And I fear that as our eloquent speakers have addressed each of them in turn, the consequences are not only unimaginably huge, if not stopped, but quite possible. I think it's at least possible, maybe more probable, that they will be extremely difficult to reverse. It's been said on, I think, this webinar series in the past, once you've compromised your sovereignty, you cannot get it back. And that's the idea. And I'm old enough to remember, you mentioned Larry McDonald, when he was still holding forth in the Congress, warning of the sorts of things that are now upon us. There was a lot of talk at the time of one world government. And I think it was generally understood to be a communist plot, completely at odds with, as again, each of you has said in your way, our constitutional republic and freedoms. And yet here we are, ladies and gentlemen. So I just want to conclude by saying I personally strongly endorse what both Alex and Reggie have said about what we must do in the face of this agenda now being apparently moved in a manner that is not going to be stopped in either the World Health Organization or the UN General Assembly. The timing may be a little unclear, especially about the WHO, the World Health Assembly specifically, when it will be acting. But as Reggie put it so eloquently, the trap is set. And whenever it is sprung, it will be devastating. We must act now. I strongly encourage everyone listening to us at the moment, and that will from here on, to go to sovereigntycoalition.org. There's there, prominently featured on the website, an American Sovereignty Declaration. You can sign on to it, if you will, and we hope you will. And you can also use an Align Act feature on that website to express to your elected officials, your senator, your members, member of the House of Representatives, that you want them to get us out of, most immediately, the World Health Organization. And we'll be talking about the UN piece of this in future conversations, I'm sure. But take action now, please. We must get our elected officials focused on this. They must act before it is too late. I want to thank all of you for listening. I want to thank each of our presenters, marvelous presentations from each of you, Pam Pryor, Jonathan Emord, Reggie Littlejohn, and Alex Newman. You are patriots of the First Order. I'm proud to be able to showcase your thoughts and work, and I hope you will come back to us in the future, certainly with updates on all of this. It's urgently needed. I want to thank each of you for listening as well. It's been a privilege to have a chance to visit with you on this occasion. Please subscribe to the rest of this webinar series, and more to the point, help us disseminate it further. With that, I'm going to say, please check out the book, The Indictment. It's available now for pre-order, and come back to us for more of these webinars next week. Until then, thank you for listening and watching. Over to you, DD Logason.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks to all of our panelists, and most especially thank you to our audience for being here today. A video of this webinar will post to presentdangerchina.org within a day or two of the conclusion of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the USA is betrayed by CCP captured elites. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.
Hey, 99% of people with an IRA or 401k will not see this video, and that would be a tragedy. Why is that? Well, because Forbes recently commissioned an independent study and quickly saw through the president's lies. He's not fighting for American workers or those on a fixed income. In fact, he wants to pull the rug out from under you and end tax benefits for folks with more than $20,000 in their IRA and 401k accounts. So if you have retirement savings you cannot afford to lose, then you should pay close attention to this short video because the implications are catastrophic. You see, this president wants to raise $3.3 trillion in new taxes, and he's gunning for your retirement accounts to help him do just that. And this is not the first time he's found new ways to tax retirees. After all, Social Security wasn't taxable until he voted for a 50% tax, and his vote was instrumental in ramrodding retirees with an even higher 85% tax. Plus, he's recently committed himself to radical wealth redistribution. Already, those in power are rushing massive tax hikes through Congress while they still have a majority, which is why most Americans who are retired or about to retire feel completely helpless because they know this new administration will force them to foot the bill. So if your IRA, 401k, or pension savings took a hit during the 2008 to 2010 crisis, then you better cinch your belt real tight because experts predict a financial haircut unlike any other. Frankly, it makes my teeth grind. But here's the good news. You don't have to sit back and let the IRS ravage your hard-won nest egg. You can fight back right now before this president has his way and before the U.S. dollar collapses from all of his reckless spending. Just click on the button you see on your screen right now. When you do so, you'll request a free physical copy of your Wealth Protection Guide. This free 25-page guide reveals a legal IRS-proof loophole that could help you take back control of your retirement and protect your IRA, 401k, and pension savings. With inflation projected to eat into your retirement assets this year, and with taxes about to raid your hard-won nest egg, I urge you to not let your golden years plan get ruined. So heed these warnings. Click the button you see now and grab your free 25-page Wealth Protection Guide.